And I call the honourable member for Menzies.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the Families, Housing, Community Services and Indigenous Affairs and Other Legislation Amendment, Election Commitments and Other Measures Bill 2011. Through this bill, the Gillard Labor government is seeking to legislate to give effect to some of its election commitments. One assumes that these are commitments it is happy to uphold, unlike the fraud the Prime Minister perpetrated on the Australian people when she, together with her government's alliance partner the Greens, announced a carbon tax, a massive assault on Australian families and their household budgets. I was of the view that the faceless men of the Labor Party wielded the power, but in this new paradigm it seems that it's not them at all, it's the Greens. When the Prime Minister lost her majority and lost her legitimacy after the 2010 election, Australians might be forgiven for thinking that she would have the integrity to stand by a promise not to introduce a carbon tax, but she chose not to. The Prime Minister chose to betray the Australian people. She chose to put her alliance with the Greens before the interests of the Australian people. It's a decision for which she will be held accountable. It's a decision for which she will be judged by all Australians. Madam Acting Deputy Speaker, this bill seeks to amend the Social Security Act 1991, the Veterans Entitlement Act 1986, the New Tax System Family Assistance Act 1999, a New Tax System Family Assistance Administration Act 1999, the Income Tax Assessment Act 1999 and the Social Security Administration Act 1999. In seeking to amend the Social Security Act 1991 and the Veterans Entitlements Act of 1986, the bill seeks to give effect to proposed changes to the work bonus to exempt the first $250 per fortnight of employment income from the income test and introduce an employment income concession bank to enable pensioners to accrue any unused amounts of the $250 fortnightly exemption to a maximum of $6,500, whilst also offsetting future assessable employment income. The bill seeks also to increase incentives for age pension recipients and Veterans Affairs income support pensioners to work by enabling them to keep more of their pension when they are working. The Coalition raised the issue of pensioners who worked in various seasonal type employments, for example, Santas and school exam supervisors, were having their pensions cut or reduced as a result of the short-term income that they were receiving. There's a well-known case here in Canberra, Madam Acting Deputy Speaker, of a man, like many others around this country in the Christmas season, who worked for a few weeks in a department store, receiving income as a Santa Claus, holding children on his knee, having the photographs taken with these young children. Because of that increase in income over a short period of time, was then penalised in terms of the pension as a result of that short-term work. Surely in this country an incentive for people to work, even on a seasonal basis, on a part-time basis, on a temporary basis, ought to be encouraged rather than discouraged by legislation. And the Gillard government has finally acted. But pensioners should be wary. They should be wary of a government that launched a solar panel rebate scheme and then decreed that any rebate pensioners received from selling additional electricity generated by their solar panels back into the grid was income and thus impacted on their pension. The government approach is to pretend to give on one hand but to claw it back on the other. And the Labor Greens carbon tax will also hit pensioners. Higher electricity prices, higher grocery prices, higher petrol prices, which of course flow through into the prices of almost every good and service in Australia. The Coalition welcomes the changes to work bonus, changes it called for and changes which it proposed. The amendments to Family Tax Benefit Part A were taken from the recommendations of the Henry Review, which argued that family payments should be the main focus of assistance for children aged up to 18 years or until the completion of secondary school in the year a person turns 18. The proposed amendments will raise the payment rates for each eligible child aged 16 to 19 so that they are the same as those aged 13 to 15. These amendments will have flow-on effect in terms of rent assistance, as the increased rates for older children will make them eligible to be considered a rent assistance child. Currently, rent assistance cannot be claimed in respect of children aged 16 and over. The bill will position the FTBA as the primary form of assistance offered for young people undertaking secondary education or the vocational equivalent. The proposed measures are also intended to ensure that families are not put in a position of attempting to calculate which payment is best for them. I had hoped that this bill might reverse the contempt that the government has shown for rural and regional students, but I'll return to that later. It seems that it's more important for Labor to tinker with programs that have failed rather than to try and help students in need. And the latest program failure is the matched savings scheme. This scheme was introduced by Labor in 2009. The scheme matches dollar for dollar of savings up to $500 for persons on compulsory income management. At present, the matched savings scheme starts automatically for all who start a money management program. This change will shift the onus onto the individual to claim the MSS. The matched savings scheme is nothing more than a Labor smoke and mirrors policy. The program has been a total policy failure. On March 16, the Australian newspaper reported on just how much of a failure this program has been. Patricia Cavallis reported, and I quote, "Only one person, Madam Acting Deputy Speaker, has received the full $500 available under the Gillard government's $53 million matched savings scheme for welfare recipients launched last July," unquote. Only one. $53 million program, only one recipient, according to the report in The Australian. Indeed, Marie O'Halloran, the President of the National Welfare Rights Network, said the scheme seemed to be, and I quote, "untried, untested and unpopular." She went on, "The revelation of a next to zero take-up comes as no surprise to welfare rights. The scheme is both complex and misguided. It fails to recognise the reality of such low levels of payments and the proven levels of deprivation that social security recipients experience. Even among the most thrifty, the frugal, there is limited capacity to save," unquote. It's disappointing that rather than tackling the problems with the program, the government in this legislation is now merely tinkering around the edges. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister let the cat out of the bag last week. She said the Greens were extremists. Well, on this side of the Parliament, we've always known that. But the question for the Prime Minister is, if the Greens are extremists, why has she formed an alliance with them? Why has she formed government with them? Why is she allowing the leader of the Greens to call the shots? He receives... It's an interesting interjection which ought to be placed on the parliamentary record. The Greens, according to the member opposite, are not as extreme as the opposition. The Greens, according to the member opposite, are not as extreme as the opposition. And yet his leader has gone in the national media, has gone to the public of Australia and said just last week that the Greens are extremists. Well, of course, the question remains. If the Greens are so extremist, why do we have this formal alliance which props up the person who sits in this chair at question time, namely the Prime Minister of this country, who props up her position in government and her position in the Lodge? As my honourable friend here reminds me, she's also now a social conservative. But the question remains. The leader of the Greens receives regular briefings from the Prime Minister's office, more than, I suspect, the honourable member opposite who interjected just recently. And, of course, he, the leader of the Greens, Senator Brown, is dragging the Labor Party along as he pursues his extremist agenda. The reality is that the Labor Party's lost its way. They're no longer representing mainstream Australia. They're no longer the great party of the working class of this country. They're pandering to fringe elements and pursuing fringe issues. And there's no better example than their contempt for rural and regional Australia. What this bill doesn't do is to help regional students. In her last-minute deal, the Prime Minister did a deal with the independents to avoid an embarrassment on the floor of this place. And in doing so, Labor and the independent members of this place voted to kill off the Independent Youth Allowance Bill. Last year, all crossbench members, except the Greens, supported a motion which sought to make the Independent Youth Allowance criteria fair for all regional students. But when it actually came to supporting a bill that would make these changes, the members for Denison, the member for Lyne and Kennedy and New England voted against the Coalition's bill. Indeed, the member for Lyne seconded a motion in support of the bill proceeding and spoke in favour of it, but then at the last moment voted against after a meeting with the Prime Minister. The Coalition welcomed the support of the member for O'Connor and even the Greens member for Melbourne in supporting a debate on the Coalition's bill. Labor's commitment to independence to bring forward a review of youth allowance to report by July 1 of this year doesn't address the problem now. And there is a real problem for many students in regional areas of Australia right now. It's months before we have a review to report on July 1. And in the meantime, there are students in many parts of regional Australia who are suffering deprivation, in our view, and in the view of them and their parents and many communities around this country, because the government is not prepared to act now, and is not prepared to act now with the support, regrettably, of so many independent members of this House. And that's what the Coalition bill sought to do. Nor does Labor give any firm commitment to fixing the independent youth allowance issue. Although in the current context, it's probably better they've said nothing, as we've learnt that the Prime Minister can't keep her promises and just can't be trusted. The Prime Minister's promise of a review should be weighed against the many broken deals, bungled programs and hopeless mismanagement of youth allowance over the last few years. This Labor government promised no carbon tax, but now is drafting one. It promised a national takeover of hospitals, but scrapped the idea. It promised a national curriculum to begin in 2011, this year, but now it's been delayed at least until 2013. And the list goes on and on and on. It's time this government did what was right. Stop breaking promises. Stop taking decisions that hurt Australian families. Admit your position on youth allowance is wrong and support the amendment that I have circulated in my name and which I now, Madam Acting Deputy Speaker, formally move.